Jane met Sean Diddy Combs under glamorous circumstances, but what began as a relationship quickly slid into something far darker. In court, Jane described how her connection to Diddy seemed romantic at first, filled with expensive gifts, promises of lavish trips, and the kind of attention most people only dream of. But beneath the surface, a complex web of control and manipulation was forming. Diddy provided for her, yes. He paid her rent, gave her cash, sent gifts, but those comforts came with conditions. Jane testified that early on she found herself participating in what Diddy called hotel nights or freak-offs, evenings where she was expected to perform sexual acts in front of him, often with men she didn't know. The court heard that even after vomiting from exhaustion, even when she voiced discomfort, the expectation didn't change. She recalled nights where she was physically and emotionally drained, yet still had to comply. She told the court she tried to express her reluctance in various ways, through texts, conversations, even diary-like entries in her phone's notes app, but the nights continued. A September 15, 2023 text exchange revealed the twisted nature of their dynamic. Jane messaged Diddy, "Love and miss you, mine's forever," only to receive a reply demanding, "Send me some shat of you being a bad girl." She believed that meant sexually explicit videos, and when she refused, Diddy pushed harder. "Don't say no to me," he said, reminding her that he controlled the phones on which their private videos were recorded. He implied that those recordings were accessible not just to him, but to his assistants and staff, turning their intimacy into a networked archive of control. In another exchange, she accused him of using their videos to become aroused with other women. He dismissed her concerns, minimized her discomfort, and when she pushed back, she was ignored or emotionally dismissed. This wasn't a couple working through problems. This was a man systematically chipping away at her sense of agency. Jane described how Diddy would promise her things, a romantic yacht trip, special dinners, alone time, and then use those promises to coax her into doing things she didn't want to do. The trip never happened, the dinners never came, but the hotel nights did. Repeatedly, prosecutors argue this was sex trafficking by fraud, not in the traditional sense of abduction or physical restraint, but through emotional manipulation, convincing her to comply by dangling hope in front of her. Jane's own words were read in court. "I don't want to be used and locked in a room to fulfill your fantasies." She wasn't describing a one-time betrayal. She was mapping out a pattern, a cycle of coercion disguised as romance. Her text messages became emotional landmines. "I opened Pandora's box. One night of fun turned into our entire relationship," she wrote. "I'm crying as I'm writing this." Yet despite her desperation, Diddy responded with silence or vague reassurances. In an audio recording played for the jury, Diddy's raspy voice said they had an open relationship, brushing off her emotional turmoil. When Jane thought they were spending a quiet weekend together in New York, she found herself again thrust into a freak-off, this time involving a known escort named Cabraw, flown in at Diddy's request. These weren't isolated incidents, they were orchestrated patterns. Jane said she often felt like a secret, while Diddy paraded other women publicly. Her job, she testified, became organizing these sex nights, bringing in other men, fulfilling whatever fantasy he demanded. And when she voiced resistance, the manipulation deepened. The jury heard texts where Jane told Diddy she no longer wanted to do these hotel nights. She told him she didn't want to be used. Still, she kept going back, and that's where this story becomes even more disturbing. Jane's continued compliance wasn't evidence of consent. It was a symptom of trauma, of dependency, of someone trapped in a relationship that blurred the lines between intimacy and exploitation. In one message, she said the experiences were desensitizing sex for her. "I'm not a porn star," she wrote. "It's been 3 years of me having to fuck strangers." There's a brutal honesty in her words, an exhaustion, a cry for recognition. She accused Diddy of pairing her with random men for his own sick sexual pleasures. And when she resisted, he reminded her of what she stood to lose. "You're burning a bridge you're going to need tomorrow," he warned. The jury saw a pattern. Sex acts in multiple cities, financial support dangled like a carrot, emotional threats if she stepped out of line. She tried to leave, tried to assert herself, but always ended up pulled back in. Perhaps the most chilling moment came when Jane admitted on the stand that she consented to being on video. At first, this appeared to undercut her story, until she explained why. "I knew I had consented, but I was uncomfortable," she testified. "I kept doing this because I loved Diddy." That statement, so simple, yet so devastating, cut to the heart of the case. Love isn't always safe. It can be manipulated, used as leverage. Jane said she watched those videos of herself, high, dissociated, like watching the same show on repeat. A disturbing show where her discomfort was masked by forced smiles and dim lighting, where love was a transaction and her body was the currency. In this first chapter of Jane's testimony, the court was given a glimpse into a world where trauma wore designer clothes and coercion came wrapped in affection, where gifts were not free and consent was not simple. The jury wasn't asked to feel sorry for Jane. They were asked to understand her. And if today's testimony proved anything, it's that understanding might be the most powerful form of justice she's been offered yet. What Jane described next in her testimony painted an even darker picture of the relationship she was in, one that looked romantic on the outside, but, as she revealed, was driven by calculated manipulation behind the scenes. According to Jane, things didn't start with clear abuse. It was subtle, gradual. At first, she was simply accompanying Diddy, sharing affection, enjoying luxury. But then came the text messages, ones that were not about love or connection, but about submission and obedience. Messages where Diddy expected her to behave in ways that fulfilled his fantasies, regardless of how she felt. She recalled a September 2023 exchange where she told him she loved and missed him. His response? A request for her to send me some shit of you being a bad girl. She immediately knew it was about sending sexually explicit content. When she hesitated, Diddy didn't ask why. He told her plainly, "Don't say no to me," reinforcing his control and the expectation that her job was to comply, not question. Jane told the court that Diddy had more than one phone, and it wasn't just for business. These phones were used to record their intimate encounters, sometimes with just the two of them, sometimes involving others. What made things worse was that his assistants and staff had access to those recordings. It wasn't just personal, it was organized. When Jane protested, saying she didn't want to send a video, Diddy responded coldly, "Stop it." Then he reminded her he had control over the footage, reinforcing the idea that her image, her body, and her experiences were never entirely hers. One of the most damning pieces of testimony came when Jane accused Diddy of using their personal videos to arouse himself before being with other women. She said she saw him on a podcast bragging about a 48-hour sex marathon with another woman. He denied it, telling her it was just podcast talk. But in her eyes, it wasn't a joke. It was a betrayal. He had promised to take her on that trip, made her believe she'd be the one on that yacht. She agreed to one more hotel night because of that promise. But the trip never came. The night did. Jane's account pointed to a repeated pattern: promises followed by disappointment, manipulation masked as love. The prosecution highlighted this as sex trafficking by fraud. He made her believe they were in a real relationship. He offered her emotional and material rewards in exchange for compliance. But when it came time to deliver on those promises, time alone, special dinners, genuine affection, those things were always withheld. What remained was performance and silence. Another text, This one from September 16, 2023, gave even more insight into Jane's mental state. It was a note written in her phone like a diary entry and later sent as a message. "As much as I want to see you, I don't want to be treated like a hoe in a hotel room," she wrote. Her testimony revealed that this wasn't just a sudden outburst. She had been journaling these feelings, struggling to process what was happening while still trying to make sense of her attachment to Diddy. Diddy's response was dismissive. He downplayed her pain, saying things like, "I was alone," "You're always tripping," and "That was just talk." He even invoked his daughter, swearing on baby love that he hadn't had sex on the trip, trying to use paternal credibility to shield himself from guilt. But Jane pushed back. "That wasn't podcast talk," she told him. She said she felt like she was being used to fulfill his fantasies while he courted other women publicly. She was the one kept hidden, the one tasked with recruiting others and performing for his pleasure behind closed doors. The jury heard more of Jane's emotional unraveling through texts. She said she wanted to go back to the early days of their relationship, writing, "One night of fun turned into our entire relationship." She described crying as she wrote these messages, admitting that she felt like she had opened Pandora's box. At this point, she wasn't just upset. She was overwhelmed, exhausted, and clearly trapped in a cycle she couldn't break. In one audio recording, played aloud in court, Diddy's voice was heard, sick and raspy, telling her, "We have an open relationship. What's the problem?" He didn't address her discomfort. He didn't ask what she needed. Instead, he offered hollow reassurances and evasions. When Jane agreed to visit him in New York again, she believed it was for quality time with her partner. Instead, it turned into another freak-off. Escort Cabral was flown in from Atlanta. Jane participated in yet another encounter, with Diddy, watching. There was no intimacy, no romance, just a performance. Jane explained that Diddy made her feel like she wasn't good enough to be shown publicly. He bragged about other women. She was his secret. She wasn't allowed to say no. And when she tried, he would remind her of what he gave her: rent, gifts, the appearance of stability. It was all conditional. All of it came at a price. She described a moment where she told him, "I don't want to be used and locked in a hotel room. I'm starting to realize what this is." That statement was devastating. She had spent months, maybe years, believing she was in a relationship. Now she was confronting the reality. She had been trafficked under the guise of love. Despite her growing awareness, Jane admitted that she continued to engage in these nights. She explained that she loved him. She felt she owed him. She said she didn't want to disappoint him. She wasn't a willing participant, but a manipulated one. The prosecution anticipated the defense's angle, that continued participation implied consent. But Jane's testimony made it clear. She stayed because leaving wasn't a real option. This section of Jane's testimony revealed the early environment of control, emotional dependency, sexual coercion, and subtle threats, disguised as affection. Her story wasn't about a sudden moment of abuse. It was about a slow erosion of her autonomy. The jury didn't just hear about sex acts. They heard about promises broken, emotional leverage, and a woman who gradually lost her sense of self. The prosecution's job now is to prove that what looked like a relationship was actually a system designed to exploit her from the moment she said yes. As Jane's testimony continued, the prosecution began to pull back the curtain on what they alleged to be a calculated system of psychological domination and manipulation, a system in which Diddy used affection, wealth, intimidation, and emotional whiplash to maintain complete control over her. This wasn't just about lavish gifts or romantic betrayal. It was about a cycle of coercion so intricately woven that Jane herself struggled to separate love from exploitation. Throughout the trial, text messages played a central role. Although the jury saw the exhibits directly, Jane and the prosecutors recited key messages aloud in court, offering a chilling look into their relationship's dynamic. In one such exchange, Diddy demanded sexually explicit content from Jane while she attempted to express that she was uncomfortable. When she declined, he didn't take no for an answer. Instead, he reminded her of their shared explicit videos stored on his multiple phones, devices that not only he but his assistants had access to. These weren't just memories of intimacy, they were tools of surveillance and pressure. Jane described how Diddy would push her to continue these so-called freak-offs, even when she was clear about her unwillingness. According to her, he used emotional manipulation wrapped in seemingly caring language. In one message, he told her he was sad and confused, asking, "What happened?" after she expressed that she felt like she was being used. Her response was painfully direct. "I don't want to be used and locked in a room to fulfill your fantasies." She wasn't vague. She was pleading. But each time she tried to reclaim her autonomy, she was met with rebuttals, guilt-tripping, or outright dismissal. One particularly revealing message from Jane, written in her Notes app and sent to Diddy as a text, read like a personal diary entry. She said, "As much as I want to see you, I don't want to be treated like a hoe in a hotel room." These weren't just rants. They were documented cries for help, filled with emotional clarity. Jane explained that she often used the Notes app to process her thoughts before sharing them with Diddy. These weren't impulsive texts. They were reflections of a woman wrestling with trauma. In another conversation, she told Diddy directly, "I want to go back to when we first started dating. I opened Pandora's box and now I can't close it." Diddy, in return, offered superficial comfort. "Stop, girl. Let's talk." Then he sent her an audio message where he never once addressed her feelings about the coercion. Instead, he said he was sick, that they had an open relationship, and asked, "What's the problem?" Jane testified that after hearing this message and receiving calls from him, she agreed to visit him in New York in September 2023, believing it would be time spent alone, repairing their connection. But what actually happened revealed the system of control was still fully intact. Once she arrived, the promise of alone time was broken. Diddy had already arranged for an escort, Cabral, to be flown in from Atlanta. Jane participated in another freak-off while Diddy watched. Her consent, if it could be called that, was never enthusiastic. She described it as resignation. She was already there, already involved, emotionally entangled, and financially dependent. What choice did she really have? In court, prosecutors laid out the details of how Diddy kept Jane in this system. They presented messages in which she directly confronted him. "You're using me," she said. "I'm tired of this." Yet the cycle never broke. Instead, Diddy continued to leverage her love and dependency against her. When she threatened to walk away, he responded with cryptic messages like, "You're burning a bridge you'll need tomorrow." That wasn't just a warning. It was a promise. A promise that walking away would cost her everything. The prosecution also presented a note where Jane wrote about feeling like she was becoming desensitized to sex. She wrote, "I'm not a porn star. These experiences are messing with my head." And when she pointed this out to Diddy, he would minimize her concerns, insisting it was all consensual or telling her she was overreacting. But in reality, Diddy was building a wall of gaslighting around her. When she said she didn't want to do it anymore, he reminded her of their open relationship. When she said she was feeling exploited, he told her she had agreed to it, even appeared happy on tape. The recordings played in court told a similar story. In one audio message, Diddy is heard calmly saying, "It was some kinky shit. I thought we both enjoyed it." He downplayed her distress, insisting that everything was mutual, but Jane testified that she didn't even know she was being recorded. During that call, she had no idea the conversation was being documented. She remembered him scratching notes onto paper, using a Sharpie during their conversation, possibly scripting a narrative he could use later. Prosecutors argued that this was evidence of consciousness of guilt, that Diddy anticipated legal trouble and was working to construct a paper trail that would make their encounters appear consensual. The call took place shortly after Cassie Ventura's bombshell lawsuit, and Diddy's tone throughout the call seemed rehearsed, more like a publicist than a partner. Financial control was another lever Diddy used to keep Jane tied to him. The court heard how he discouraged her from earning her own income, even when she tried to start an OnlyFans account. He told her it was beneath her. Jane recalled a brief period of financial independence in early 2024, but Diddy responded by going through her phone, confronting her about money she received from another man, and threatening to cut her off. In a text from March 7, 2024, Diddy asked what would happen when he came over, and Jane tried to de-escalate, suggesting she get the house ready. He replied coldly, saying they needed a clean break and that she should sign something. The boss' implication was clear. If she wanted to be free, she'd also lose everything he provided. Jane told the court that despite making some income, she was still barely scraping by, living off credit card debt and loans, still needing rent support. She texted Diddy, "You bring up my rent every time you don't get your way." Even their financial agreement, what she called a love contract, was conditional. 2 years of rent paid in exchange for loyalty and compliance. Not love, not partnership, compliance. By the time the jury heard about the extortion attempt by Cabra, a former escort who threatened to leak sex tapes if not paid $10,000, the system Diddy created felt airtight. Jane testified that Diddy had mistakenly used Cabra's phone to record one of their sessions, giving Cabra leverage. Jane received threats, media inquiries, and feared public humiliation. Diddy covered her legal fees, but even that felt like control masked as support. He kept her close, even as her world began to unravel. Through texts, audio recordings, and emotional testimony, the prosecution painted a damning picture. A high-powered man who built an emotional and financial cage for Jane, using her love, her vulnerability, and her economic fragility as tools to control her. Every time she tried to leave, he'd pull her back with a gift, a threat, a promise, or a plea. And slowly, Jane stopped fighting. She didn't stop because she wanted to stay. She stopped because she didn't know how to leave. That is the essence of coercion. And that is the system Jane said she lived in. By the time Jane took the stand to describe the personal toll her relationship with Diddy had taken, the courtroom had already heard chilling details of coercion, manipulation, and control. But this next section of her testimony pulled back the curtain even further, revealing the long-term damage that extended beyond hotel rooms and late-night messages. The audience wasn't just seeing a victim of exploitation. They were seeing a woman who, piece by piece, had watched her emotional, mental, and financial stability unravel. One of the most heart-wrenching aspects of Jane's story was how deeply the manipulation affected her emotional health. She testified that her sense of intimacy had been completely eroded, that after years of being paired with strangers for Diddy's gratification, sex no longer felt like an act of connection. It felt like a chore. In messages read aloud in court, she stated bluntly, "These experiences are desensitizing sex for me. It's been 3 years of me having to fucking strangers." She wasn't venting. She was documenting the numbness that had crept in after repeated trauma. Her testimony continued with even more distressing messages. "You pair me up with some random man," she once wrote to Diddy. "Any deed not for your own sick sexual—" She trailed off in the message, but the meaning was unmistakable. She felt like a puppet in his fantasy, her own wants, needs, and emotions buried under the obligation to perform. Jane told the court that this repeated abuse caused her to experience symptoms of PTSD. She wrote about having to numb herself emotionally just to get through each night. But it wasn't just her mental health that suffered. Her finances, independence, and professional life were also tightly bound to Diddy's grip. Jane testified that any attempt to earn her own income was met with resistance. She recounted a time in early 2024 when she started an OnlyFans page in a desperate bid to reclaim some autonomy. During a break in their relationship, her earnings began to improve. She even received child support and a one-time payment of $9,000 from a man she never met in person in exchange for modeling for his brand. But when Diddy found out about the payments and her content, the backlash was immediate. He combed through her phone, read her messages, and accused her of betrayal. What made it even more painful was the fact that Jane wasn't thriving. She was still struggling to pay off debt and make ends meet. She described penny pinching, taking out credit card loans and barely staying afloat. Diddy had given her the illusion of security, but once she tried to stand on her own, that support was used as a weapon against her. In a text from March 2024, Jane pleaded with Diddy not to cut her off. "You're bringing up my rent every time you don't get your way," she wrote. She reminded him of their love contract, an agreement where he promised to pay her rent for 2 years, but that agreement, too, was only honored as long as she did what he wanted. Once she tried to assert herself, the contract became a threat. She even asked if he had instructed his assistant, Robin, to cancel her lease after receiving a message that her apartment contract was expiring. This type of financial control was critical to the prosecution's case. Jane testified that even when she managed to generate some income, she still depended on Diddy's money to survive. It was a cycle. He discouraged her from being independent, then accused her of disloyalty when she tried. She said that all she had asked for was 3 months to get on her feet. That's all. But instead, she got judgment, monitoring, and more pressure. All of this unfolded while Jane was still trying to navigate her emotional connection to him. Despite the abuse, she admitted she still had feelings for Diddy. This emotional confusion wasn't just about attachment, it was the result of being conditioned to equate love with suffering. The messages she sent, the concessions she made, the way she apologized after being hurt, it all pointed to someone caught in a trauma bond. She didn't just fear being alone. She feared what her life would look like without him, without the version of security he controlled. Even after explosive moments like the freak-off involving Anton, which took place after a violent altercation, Jane still went along with what he asked. She helped arrange the evening. She dressed up. She tried to bury the bruises, because walking away didn't feel like a choice. Diddy had made her world so small, so dependent on him, that she couldn't imagine an escape. The emotional damage also bled into her professional confidence. Jane told the court that she once had aspirations of building her own career, but over time those dreams faded. Being with Diddy consumed her energy and her focus. Instead of advancing her personal goals, she spent her days managing his needs, scheduling escort sessions and managing his emotional outbursts. Her time, her body, her emotional space, none of it was truly hers. What made her testimony so powerful was the way she described all of this without self-pity. She spoke softly, almost guardedly, and yet her words carried undeniable weight. She wasn't just a partner, she wasn't just a girlfriend. She had become a mechanism in someone else's machine, kept functional only as long as she played her role. When she didn't, the money disappeared. The affection disappeared, and the threats took their place. Through it all, Jane said she never stopped trying to understand what was happening to her. She journaled, wrote long messages, sent texts she knew might be ignored. She said she often felt like she was watching herself from the outside, unable to stop what was happening, but unable to leave. She described watching the freak-off videos, recognizing her own face, her own voice, but not recognizing the version of herself in them. That was someone who had learned how to dissociate just to survive. Perhaps one of the most sobering revelations came when Jane explained that even the legal representation she had during the trial was paid for by Diddy. Her rent, her lawyers, her life, still funded by the same man she was testifying against. This fact didn't just complicate the case, it reinforced the theme that ran through every part of her testimony: control, emotional, financial, psychological. The strings were always attached. The courtroom heard all of this not as isolated incidents, but as the slow erosion of a woman's identity. Jane's trauma didn't begin with a single moment. It began with promises, with a sense of being special. And as that illusion cracked, she didn't just lose her peace of mind. She lost her independence, her ambition, and her sense of self-worth. What she described on the stand was the full impact of long-term coercion, one that doesn't leave physical bruises alone, but also breaks a person from the inside out. As the jury absorbed every detail, every message, every recorded call, what became clear was that this wasn't just about the nights in hotels. It was about what happened after. When the doors closed and the lights went off, and Jane was left to pick up the pieces of a life that had been hijacked, one coercive message, one broken promise at a time. When Jane made the decision to testify, it wasn't a sudden, empowered break from abuse. It was something far more complex, delayed, and emotionally layered. In court, she revealed that she had not spoken to prosecutors before being subpoenaed in November 2024, 2 months after Diddy's arrest. Her initial cooperation with law enforcement came not from a proactive desire to expose him, but from legal obligation. In fact, between November and January, she had no follow-up meetings with the government. Her silence wasn't defiance, it was processing. Jane testified that during this time, she had just started therapy and was still trying to make sense of everything that had happened, especially the events of June 18, 2024. That date, June 18th, became a cornerstone of her testimony. It was the night she said everything broke open. According to Jane, it started with Diddy coming back from a family trip to Utah. His assistant Jonathan helped set up her apartment to make it perfect for him. Candles, stocked fridge, red lighting, Diddy's preference. Jane described the evening as one she thought would be calm, intimate. Instead, it spiraled into a violent encounter. She testified that after confronting him about the young woman he had been with on the Utah trip, things escalated quickly. She admitted she called him a pedophile, though prosecutors clarified that the woman was not underage, only significantly younger. The argument turned physical. Jane said she pushed his head down while he was bending over, threw candles, and shouted that she hated him. She testified that Diddy began screaming back, calling her crazy, then started kicking down doors, her bedroom door, her bathroom door, even her closet. When she tried to escape, she said he grabbed her, choked her until she was on her tiptoes, and left her gasping for breath. Jane said she fled barefoot, wearing only a dress, and hid 6 blocks away behind a wall, terrified and alone. But the violence didn't end there. Jane described returning home only to be dragged back inside by Diddy. She told the jury he punched her in the head multiple times, kicked her, and screamed that she was trying to take him away from his family. She recalled curling into a ball on the patio, trying to protect herself as he struck her repeatedly. The assault continued into the shower, where she said he slapped her while fully clothed, while she was naked and vulnerable. And even after all of that, he insisted the night wasn't over. She testified that Diddy ordered an escort named Anton to the house. He even used her phone to text him, and when Anton arrived, she said she opened the gate for him and later performed oral sex while still recovering from the violence. She admitted she was high on ecstasy and didn't feel present in her own body. "I felt like I wasn't even there," she said. She covered the bruises with makeup. She covered the knots on her forehead with her hair. Because that was the routine. That was the system. And yet Jane didn't go to the authorities right after that. She didn't run. She didn't file a report. She stayed. According to her, The next time she saw Diddy after that brutal night wasn't until a month later in July. He gave her money to fix the broken doors. He also gave her money to pay Anton, sending thousands of dollars in an Uber. It was an expensive cover-up, not just in cash but in silence. Jane explained that it wasn't until April 2025, almost a year after the violent night, that she told prosecutors about what had happened on June 18th. Until then, the only people she had shared it with were Diddy's attorneys. That detail shook the courtroom. She hadn't gone to the people who could protect her. She went to the people protecting him. When asked why, she said she felt obligated. It was a chilling reminder of how control doesn't vanish when abuse ends. It lingers. And perhaps even more disturbing was that she told Diddy's legal team about the assault before she ever told the government. This delay didn't weaken her credibility. In many ways, it made her testimony more human, more relatable. Jane wasn't the perfect victim. She was still tethered to her abuser. Diddy still paid her rent. He still funded her lawyer. She was, in many ways, still under his shadow. And yet, she sat in that courtroom, exposed and alone, recounting every moment. It wasn't clean. It wasn't brave in the way movies make it seem. It was raw, messy, conflicted, and completely real. One of the most emotional moments came when she was asked how she felt about Diddy now. She didn't say she hated him. She didn't scream revenge. She didn't even cry. She said, "I pray for his continued healing and for peace for him." It stunned the courtroom. She didn't look at him. She didn't even lift her head. Her voice, soft and deliberate, offered a closing statement more powerful than any headline could capture. Jane's testimony isn't just important for what it says about Diddy. It's important for what it says about the dynamics of power, coercion, and emotional entrapment. This case isn't about a woman chained in a basement or trafficked across borders. It's about a woman emotionally bound to a man who gave her everything and took even more. It's about a kind of trafficking that happens in luxury apartments, through text messages, on private flights. It's about how love, when twisted by manipulation, becomes a trap disguised as protection. For prosecutors, Jane's account supports broader racketeering and trafficking charges. It shows a pattern: recruiting women, coercing them through gifts and threats, transporting them across state lines, and using emotional control to ensure their compliance. Her story, while not fitting the traditional mold of victimhood, makes a compelling case for expanding the way we understand consent and exploitation. For the public, Jane's testimony is a wake-up call. It forces us to ask difficult questions. Can someone love their abuser and still be a victim? Can financial support be a form of control? Is silence always a sign of complicity? Or can it be the result of fear, shame, and dependency? These are the uncomfortable truths at the center of her narrative. Jane's decision to testify didn't come from triumph. It came from trauma. And yet, her willingness to relive it in front of a courtroom, with Diddy seated just feet away, sends a message, more powerful than any verdict could deliver. It tells other victims that even in confusion, even in dependency, even in fear, they are not alone. And sometimes, just telling the truth is the bravest thing they can do. Jane's testimony wasn't just a recitation of facts or a string of accusations. It was the unraveling of a journey that began with love and ended in survival. In the courtroom, through her words, her texts, her voice, and even her silences, she reconstructed a relationship built on power, maintained through manipulation, and weaponized through emotional, financial, and physical control. From the early days of luxury and affection to the horrifying night of June 18, 2024, when she ran barefoot into the street trying to escape the man she once loved, every piece of her story painted a portrait that was both intimate and systemic. Her path to speaking out wasn't immediate. Jane didn't come forward with fire in her voice or vengeance in her heart. She didn't storm into a police station or launch a lawsuit. She waited. She processed. She broke slowly. She was subpoenaed. Then she spoke. And when she did, she brought with her the kind of vulnerability and contradiction that made her story real. This wasn't a clean break from abuse. It was a hesitant, painful, conflicted release. What makes her testimony so profoundly impactful is how it shattered the myth of what a victim is supposed to look like. Jane wasn't rescued from a van. She wasn't locked in a basement. She lived in luxury. She flew first class. She dined with celebrities. But she was not free. Her consent was constantly manipulated. Her choices were shaped by threats, some spoken, some implied. Her emotional attachments were used against her, and the man who made her feel special was the same man who made her feel disposable. In her words, we saw a pattern familiar in cycles of abuse but often ignored in conversations about trafficking. She loved him. She feared him. She depended on him. She apologized after being hurt. She covered bruises with makeup and knots with her hair. She accepted money even after being beaten, not because she was weak, but because he taught her that. Survival looked like silence. That loyalty looked like submission. That love meant enduring whatever came next. From start to finish, Jane's journey was marked by contradiction. She expressed affection even while describing violence. She sent heart emojis in texts that came after threats. She cried over losing someone who had choked her in a bathroom, kicked in her doors, and ordered her to perform for others while she was in emotional and physical pain. These contradictions weren't inconsistencies. They were evidence. Evidence of a mind caught between trauma and hope, between a fantasy and a nightmare. And that's what makes Jane's testimony so vital. It invites the world to consider a broader, more nuanced understanding of abuse and exploitation. It pushes us to expand how we define trafficking, not just as movement across borders or physical imprisonment, but as emotional entrapment built on calculated dependency. In Jane's case, the chains weren't metal. They were psychological, and they were just as binding. Jane's journey also highlights the role of power and privilege in shielding abuse. Diddy wasn't just her partner. He was a powerful figure, someone who controlled not just her lifestyle, but her perception of reality. When she said no, he said, "Don't say no to me." When she resisted, he reminded her of everything he provided: her rent, her gifts, her status. When she wanted to leave, he offered emotional guilt or reminded her she was burning a bridge. These weren't just personal manipulation tactics. They were tools used by someone who understood how to keep people tethered through fear, hope, and obligation. Even after the assaults, the coercion, the exploitation, Jane was still praying for him, still asking for his peace, still struggling to let go. And that, perhaps, was the most humanizing part of her story. It wasn't a declaration of hatred. It wasn't a cry for revenge. It was a quiet, broken hope that the person she once believed in might someday become the person she imagined he could be. But she wasn't testifying for him. She was testifying for herself, and maybe for others like her. Her voice, soft and often trembling, did what years of silence could not. It exposed the hidden mechanics of emotional abuse within a world glamorized by wealth and status. Her courage wasn't in being perfect. It was in being honest, and in doing so, she gave prosecutors the ammunition to redefine what trafficking can look like in modern America. She gave the jury and the public a look at how abuse thrives, not just in shadows but in mansions, not just in poverty but in privilege. Legally, her testimony may be the cornerstone for the broader federal case. Her detailed descriptions of emotional manipulation, financial control, and coerced sex across state lines align with the definitions of trafficking and racketeering. Her story could influence how prosecutors in future cases pursue justice for victims whose suffering doesn't fit neatly into conventional narratives. Socially, her words echo far beyond the courtroom. They speak to every person who has stayed too long in a toxic relationship, To everyone who has mistaken control for care, to anyone who has wondered why victims don't leave. They show that survival sometimes looks like staying quiet, going along, pretending to be okay, until one day you're not, and finally, you speak. The impact of Jane's testimony isn't just in what it reveals about Diddy, it's in what it reveals about us. About what we expect victims to sound like, about how we treat women who don't leave right away, about how society responds when abuse wears designer labels and comes with expensive gifts. She challenged every stereotype. She didn't scream. She didn't sob uncontrollably. She spoke. And that was enough. As this case moves forward, Jane's story will be a measuring stick for the law, for the media, for public perception. It will test our ability to believe a woman whose trauma is invisible to the eye, but etched into every message, every note, every moment of her life that she had to justify or endure. In the end, Jane didn't just share her story, she redefined what it means to survive. Not perfectly, not cleanly, but truthfully. Her testimony is a reminder that even when you're still healing, even when you're still conflicted, even when the person who hurt you still pays your rent, you can still stand up and speak. And sometimes that's the beginning of justice. Not just for her, but for every woman watching who sees a piece of themselves in her silence, her strength, and her final decision to say, "This is what happened, and I am not afraid to tell it anymore."